It seems like it happened. Ukraine apparently has already used the FP-5 Flamingo, its domestic cruise missile, for the very first time, and that has dramatic strategic implications. We'll talk about this as well as about what happened along the front line. I'm going to give a short sitrep about the changes along the front line before we dive deeper into the topic of the FP-5 Flamingo and what that usage means for the Russians, what disaster that can be for the Russians. But I said all of this here in the sitrep about the war in Ukraine. The Russians once again attacked the Ukrainians with over 500 flying objects, so cruise missiles, ballistic missiles and drones in one of the biggest attacks of the war so far. But Ukraine has struck back with numerous drones attack, but also with the first usage of the Flamingos. We'll start quickly with the front lines here. Sumi, I cannot observe any changes along the front line, but a Russian mill blogger is reporting that the the Russian soldiers are currently being told that North Koreans are being deployed soon. So supposedly the Russian soldiers are being prepared that soon there will be North Koreans to diminish or to at least reduce the risk of friendly fire, because the Russians are surprised that there are soldiers that they can't communicate with. The Russian mill blogger, is expecting that those North Koreans are being used behind the front line. He calls them to be used as cooks and cleaners to free Russian soldiers for frontal usage in attacks. Whether or not the Russians use a lot of their soldiers as cleaners, so they have to be replaced behind the front line, is a different question, but one that we do not need to dive in here. That's it about Sumy. About Kharkiv, I do not have any change in the front lines that I can observe. From the Eastern Front here, we have reports from the Ukrainian side that, according to that, the Russians use single swimmers that cross the Oskil River here and drag a cable behind them. That cable is then connected to the other side and being used to transfer troops to the other side. How exactly is not explained, whether they use that as a guide over the water or whether they actually use it like a zip line is completely unclear. The Ukrainians try to stop that, but obviously those cables should be hard to find and thus will give the Russians some success. But so far they still are not capable of bringing heavy equipment over to the other side of the Oskil. Also, according to the Ukrainian soldiers, the Russians are trying to use the sewage pipes in the area, especially in Kupiansk here. The Russians have started using pipes, underground pipes, years ago, and this is now a recurring tactic of the Russians that is employed here. That's it on the Eastern Front. I do not see any change in territory. Neither do I see anything in regards to Siversk. In Kostiantynivka, in the Kostiantynivka region, we have the Russians being visually confirmed in Oleksandro Shultyne, which is here. Not really a change in territory that can be observed massively, and we have something interesting from Kostiantynivka, from Katerinivka here. Here in Katerinivka, we have the Ukrainians in the northwest of the town. We recently had the Russians showing their flag in the center, and there I mentioned that theoretically that could mean that Ukrainians are still there, at least in this new geolocation, the Ukrainians would still be in the northwestern part of the town of Katerinivka. Further north, the Russians have likely taken the town of Rusev Yar. We have that here geolocated as well, first in the western part of it and then operating to the north of it. So at least the western part of Rusev Yar is likely in Ukrainian hands, probably though the whole town. That's it from this direction. In Novoekonomichne, we do have two geolocations. The first one is showing Ukrainian flag in the center of Novoekonomichne, and the second one is from the southern part. Here actually a war crime was committed. A Russian soldier seems to talk to an elderly Ukrainian civilian who is clearly unarmed and in civilian clothing from a fairly short distance of roughly 10 meters before killing him. So this was a recorded war crime, and that was geolocated at this point, showing that a Russian soldier was at that point. The Ukrainians have, other than that, have continued offensive operations north of Mynograd, but I cannot see any change in territory. We switch in the Dnipro direction, and here the Russians have advanced west of Kotlyarivka. We have the geolocated here at this point, not a major difference, but this means the Russians are in this area getting closer to the oblast border. The Ukrainians have liberated Dachne down here. This is geolocated with the Ukrainians being in the center of town and raising their flag. And as this is close enough to the eastern side of the town that it's unlikely that there are Russian soldiers still here, I see Dachne as being liberated. And we have Konstantin Mashovets, a Ukrainian analyst and former a colonel of the Ukrainian armed forces. He's claiming that Seleny High is liberated by the Ukrainians as well. Konstantin Mashovets usually is very reliable, but usually, and I do not see visual evidence, and I have not seen the Russians admitting that loss yet, so it's possible that this is not correct, even though I consider it likely that the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians back here, especially as the Ukrainians recently had a couple of successful counterattacks in this region. And that's it with the territorial changes. We switch over to the main course of today. First of all, we have the Ukrainians striking Simferopol airport. They have struck helicopters there. That was geolocated that at least one Mi-8 transport helicopter was destroyed, and likely a Mi-24 Hind helicopter as well, an assault helicopter that was likely destroyed here. This shows a successful Ukrainian strike against the airport, but then there was this report that a Ukrainian strike hit a military establishment, a military installation in Voloshine. 6 air cushion boats were damaged. Those are the air cushion boats that are being used there, A8 and A25 PS. They are being used by the Russian border troops for amphibious usage here in this area. Now, this was an attack where some things were damaged, okay. Initially, it said, the Ukrainian sources said it was a usage of the Neptune missile. That was likely too, as a couple of days ago, a Neptune launcher was hit by the Russians, indicating that the Neptunes are being used in this direction and that they are available, or that they have recently been available. But now there is new claims that it was actually not the Neptune, it was the Flamingo. The base was used by FSB border troops, and the weapon was not a Flamingo, it was an FP-5. Was not a Neptune, I apologize, it was an FP-5 Flamingo. This at least according to Ukraine. They also published this video here, which we can watch quickly while I continue. Now this shows us 3 objects on the ground, and we see steam coming here, or smoke coming here and here as well. So we see 3 smoke plumes, and the first one is starting. That's the rocket booster that is being dropped here, and that's the cruise missile continuing. And we already see that there's smoke here. Now, of course, all of this can be faked. There can be artificial intelligence videos and so on and so forth. Especially the Iranians love to use that. So it's possible that this is not correct, but at least the visuals look like a clear indication that there was already one launch. So this is not a second video of the same launch. This is a second missile being launched here. Again, the booster was visible before the cruise missile continued, and a third booster here. So we have visual signs of the Russians having been attacked with 3 of these Flamingos. They have a range of 3,000 kilometers, and carry a 1,000 kilogram warhead. This means it's twice as heavy as the Tomahawk in its warhead, but while having a significantly longer range, depending on the version of the Tomahawk, even twice as much as this. At the same time, it's supposedly fairly cheap in production, in producing it, especially as the Ukrainians have lower costs in producing in their country because of lower wages, but also because the engine comes out of the L-39 that is being produced in Zaporizhzhia. So it's a domestic engine that the Ukrainians produce for decades and thus have available, and where they have streamlined the production. At the same time, the warhead seemingly is made out of FAB-1000 aerial bombs, and thus cheap cheaply available out of storage as well. This means it's cheaply to produce, it's easy to produce, which allows it to be produced in a big number. According to the Ukrainians, in October they will reach a monthly production of 200 of them, which would be massive. This could actually be breaking Russia's neck. And let me explain why. This is the range of 3,000 kilometers. If I use a western part of Ukraine as a launching point, with a range like this, it's not really important anymore where you put the starting point at all. It basically puts all of Russia's important defense industry in range. And if that industry is not in range, for instance, the Sukhoi fighter planes are being built here in the eastern part of the country, they are out of range. But what is not out of range is the factory that produces the engines that are being used there. So the Neptune puts basically all of Russia's decisive defensive industry in its range, and puts it at danger, especially as the warheads are big enough for the Neptune to actually do serious damage. But that's not all. It puts 90% of the refinery capacity that the Russians have in its range. This is in accordance not just to the refineries themselves, but also with the pipelines. 80 to 90% of all pumping stations and compressor stations, so for oil and for natural gas, are in the range of the pipelines as well. As we can see, the big fields, all of it is in range. Russian exports over Ostlunga will not work if the Ukrainians hit the pumping stations. Russian exports over the Black Sea won't work anymore if the pipelines to this point are being destroyed. And this allows the Ukrainians to basically cripple Russia's oil industry for export, but obviously also for domestic use, which will drive inflation, which will cause the Russian government to be increasingly under pressure. And we already have here the report by Bloomberg that the oil revenues of the Russian oil companies is already collapsing. We see that here in comparison to last year, the revenue has halved or even reduced further than half of the big Russian oil companies. This means less revenue for the for the Russian government, and thus less ability to keep financing it, all while the oil and gas prices in Russia are rising. In addition to this, countless railway bridges are in range that are indispensable, I think is the word. The Russians can't not use the railway for logistics. Russia is so big that regular trucks are impossible to take over logistics. In smaller countries, you might substitute railways with trucks, but this is the biggest country in the world, and you can't ride trucks and transport enough. For instance, if you receive artillery shells from the North Koreans, to truck them to the front line is absurd. That's not possible. The railway is needed for this, and the Russians have no choice but to use the railway. Not just for the transferring and for redeployment of heavy equipment like tanks, but also for the everyday usage. The volumes of material that the soldiers on the front line need, from food to artillery shells, is so big that the Russians have to use railways for this. And this is the whole Russian doctrine. So they did not even build enough trucks that even if they would want to switch to trucks, they couldn't. Russia, because of its geographic requirements, has a railway network of 100,000 kilometers. 51% of that is electrified, and of course there allows attacks as well, not just against the bridges, but also against the power plants and against the transformer stations. All of this is an ability for the Ukrainians to strike the Russian logistics. 65% of the Russian railway system is west of the Urals, and as we can see, this is not just west of the Urals, the range. The Urals are roughly here. So the Ukrainians can strike east of the Urals as well. I just take it as one measurement, but that means 65% of the Russian network is west of the Urals, and thus clearly in range, because that's where the people and the industry is. And the Russians in total have at least 30,000 railway bridges, which would allow us to assume that probably 20,000 or more are west of the Urals, and thus in the Russian range, in the Ukrainian range. The Russians have measures to treat that. They have floating bridges that they can use for railways as well. They have two systems, an older one and a newer one that was used in the past for this. The railway system that they are having recently presented is a little better than the past one. It now allows 15 kilometers an hour to be used on the train, but in total it's hours upon hours to build those floating bridges, and still the railway, the trains have to slow down massively. So depending on the weight, they can't be used simultaneously. So if an important bridge is being collapsed, even with the ability to keep the railway traffic open because of floating pontoon bridges, it still will reduce the flow through of Russian trains through all of this. At the same time, obviously, the Russians will take time to build those bridges. Those elements are not available in unlimited numbers, as they are floating in the water and not armored. They are more vulnerable even against the smaller drones. 100 kilogram warhead of a Luti drone might not be able to seriously damage or even destroy a defense industry building, a factory, but for a pontoon here, it might be a completely different story. And in total, it's so many potential targets with the bridges alone that the Russians simply can't defend it. They have no choice. They do not have enough air defense, not only because of the number of targets, but also because the Ukrainians have already destroyed hundreds of air defense systems that are no longer available. Here shows us how the attrition not just works on one side, that the Ukrainians keep striking individual SHORAD systems, individual air defense systems, individual radar systems. All of this is showing its effect now, as each of these systems that was destroyed has to be replaced, and thus means that one less system can defend anything in the background. So if the Flamingo actually works as advertised, if the Flamingo is actually available in the numbers as advertised, then Ukraine can clearly destroy more than the Russians can repair. The attacks can become so numerous that even auxiliary routes, because obviously the Russians can reroute after single attacks, even those options to reroute will be pointless. The Ukrainians will be able to do damage to a degree that can cause trouble to the Russians in a degree that was unthinkable so far. If they actually manage to produce 200 of those drones a month, that means they can basically attack daily targets inside of Russia and destroy bridges there. If this is all the true, and there's a lot of ifs still, we are inside of a war where each side has an interest to shape the informational battlefield and thus make propaganda. But if these things are true, then Russia has a problem that can break its neck. Nothing else can be said about the FP-5 Flamingo. This has to be stated about this. Obviously, we still do not know a lot of details. We do not know to which degree the Ukrainian claims are true, but if they are somewhere close to reality, then Russia has a problem that was not conceived before, that was almost inconceivable, Russia has a problem that cannot be overstated if only half of what the Ukrainians claim is true. And that was it for today's sitrep. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.